Ethan Whitfield was 13 years old the first time somebody filmed him without asking. He was dragging a cracked bathroom mirror across a dusty field behind the old smokehouse, its wooden frame catching on dry weeds every few steps. A group of older boys, 15 and 16, stood by a pickup truck near the fence line, laughing loud enough to carry. One of them pointed. Another had his phone up, recording. Nobody stopped him. Nobody helped him either. He just kept dragging the mirror toward a ring of stone, half buried near the smokehouse wall, small for his age next to boys who already had their full growth on them, and set it down beside a dozen others just like it. Everyone who watched it happen thought they understood exactly what they were looking at. A strange, quiet kid doing something a little embarrassing, probably grieving something. Nobody understood why every mirror in that county eventually ended up circling that one well. Not even the old farmer who lived across the road and watched it happen from his porch every single morning. To understand any of it, you'd have to go back 4 years to a rainstorm and a highway and a decision a 9-year-old boy didn't even know he was making. The rain started light that afternoon. By the time Ray and Carol Whitfield loaded the truck outside the farmer's market, it had turned into the kind of storm that makes county roads disappear under sheets of water. Ethan stayed home. He'd woken up with a fever that morning, and his mother pressed the back of her hand to his forehead twice before deciding he'd be more trouble at the market than help. He remembers arguing about it. He remembers losing. He was 9. He didn't know yet that losing that argument would save his life. The truck hit standing water on Route 9 outside of town. Nobody could say for certain what happened next, only that a car doesn't skid across a flooded county road, drift 3 lanes, and let both people inside walk away. Ethan's grandfather, Walt, drove out to get him that night. Neither of them said much on the way back to the farm. There wasn't much to say. People in town remember storms. They remember the thunder, the power flickering, the roads closing for an afternoon. Ethan remembers what comes after storms. The smell of wet dirt drying under sun. The way puddles shrink a little, more each hour until there's nothing left but a pale ring where the water used to sit. He started watching that instead of the sky. Walt's farm was already tired when Ethan moved in. Fences leaned. The barn roof had a soft spot nobody had gotten around to fixing. But there was a well behind the old smokehouse that hadn't drawn water in years, and one evening, not long after Ethan arrived, Walt stood beside it with his hands in his coat pockets. "People think this well died," he said, not really talking to Ethan, more talking past him. "I think people forgot how to listen to it." Ethan didn't understand what that meant. He was barely 10 then. He wouldn't understand for a long time. But he never forgot it. The town sat in the kind of open country where the horizon doesn't hide anything from you. Flat land, long roads, grain elevators visible from 3 miles out. It could have been Kansas. It could have been Nebraska or Oklahoma. The specifics didn't matter much once the drought started, creeping in the way droughts do, not with a bang but with a slow tightening, like a belt notched in one hole at a time. The old farmers noticed first. Bill Aldrich, who'd worked the same 200 acres since Nixon was president, kept saying the creek behind his property hadn't run this low since he was a boy. The mechanic at the gas station on Main Street started fielding more calls about overheating, tractors, and broken transmissions. The school principal cut the football teams' August practices short twice in 1 week because the heat index climbed past what the state allowed for full pads. It was a town where everybody still knew everybody, for better or worse. The feed store owner knew whose account was behind. The retired geography teacher, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Delacroix, still corrected people's pronunciation of Missouri out of habit. Everyone had an opinion about everyone else's business, and Ethan Whitfield's business had become the favorite topic of conversation at the diner counter. The diner itself sat right on Main Street, across from the feed store and 2 doors down from the gas station, and on slow mornings the regulars at the counter treated any new gossip like a small holiday. Ethan's mirrors gave them plenty to work with. He didn't talk much. Never had, not since the accident, though people who'd known him before said he used to be a chatterbox. Now he mostly kept to himself and collected things nobody else wanted. At 13, he was still a head shorter than most of the boys, who liked to hang around the gas station, and that gap made him an easy target. The older ones didn't hit him or shove him around, nothing like that. They just laughed loud and often, in the particular way older kids laugh at younger ones who won't fight back. Not garbage, though. That was the detail people missed. He never touched a broken washing machine or a rusted bike frame. What he wanted was anything that reflected light. Old bathroom mirrors with the silver backing peeling at the edges. Chrome bumpers stripped off dead trucks. Cracked window panes. Even an oven door somebody had thrown out after their kitchen remodel. Word got around fast in a town that size. Before long, people started leaving mirrors by their mailboxes, just to see if the boy would actually stop and load them into Walt's old flatbed. He always did. The younger kids gave him a nickname. They started calling him the Crow on account of how he collected shiny things, the way crows are supposed to. He heard it plenty of times. Once, walking past a group of them outside the gas station, he even smiled a little, which surprised the kids more than the nickname ever had. Everyone in town settled on the same explanation without ever discussing it out loud. The boy had lost his parents in a storm, and now he was doing something strange with mirrors as a way of grieving. Maybe some kind of memorial. Maybe just a coping mechanism gone a little sideways. Nobody asked him directly. It felt rude to ask a kid who'd been through what he'd been through. So the mirrors kept piling up around that old stone well behind the smokehouse, and the town kept its theories to itself, and the drought kept tightening its grip 1 dry week at a time. Walt Whitfield had never struck anyone as a superstitious man. He read the Farmer's Almanac the way some men read the sports page, and he could tell you the average rainfall for the county, going back 30 years, without looking anything up. What people didn't know was that Walt had spent decades collecting old agricultural records, going all the way back to journals kept by civilian conservation Corps crews who'd worked the land during the Dust Bowl years. He kept his own notebooks, too, dozens of them filled with handwriting that got shakier toward the end. After Walt passed, Ethan found one notebook tucked behind a stack of seed catalogs in the barn office. Most of it was ordinary. Rainfall totals. Notes on which fields needed rotating. But near the back, the entries changed tone entirely. The old settlers lined bright surfaces near dry wells. One line read, with no explanation attached. Another said, morning fog stayed longer near the reflective stones by the Hendricks place. A third simply noted, stones stayed cool longer than they should have. Don't understand why yet. The notebook stopped mid-sentence on a page dated less than a month before Walt's death. There was no conclusion, no tidy theory tying it together. Just an old man's half-finished curiosity, frozen in ink. Ethan read that notebook more times than he could count. He didn't know if any of it actually worked. He wasn't a scientist, and he wasn't pretending to be one. What he had was a habit passed down from a grandfather who noticed things other people didn't bother noticing, and a stubborn refusal to let a good question go unanswered. So he started experimenting, quietly, without telling anyone, because he already knew how it would sound if he tried explaining it. He set up his first mirror near the well on a whim, mostly just to see what Walt might have seen. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden flood of water. Just a slightly cooler patch of ground near the stone rim the next morning. One he might have imagined if he hadn't measured it with his hand the way farmers do, feeling for temperature the old-fashioned way. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to keep him dragging home the next mirror and the one after that. By the time a dozen mirrors ringed the well, the town had moved past their grief theory and landed on a new explanation, one that felt more logical to the adults who prided themselves on common sense. The boy was trying to shine sunlight down into the well to warm it up, maybe to kill off algae, maybe just out of some misguided notion about drying it out faster so he could clean it and start fresh. Bill Aldrich brought it up at the diner one morning, shaking his head. "That'll only cook whatever water's left down there," he said. Kids got the physics backwards. The high school science teacher, a young man named Mr. Ferris who'd only been in town 2 years, overheard the theory secondhand and mentioned it to his class as a cautionary example. Concentrated sunlight raises temperature. Raised temperature accelerates evaporation. If the boy wanted to save water, he was doing the opposite of what he thought he was doing. It made sense. It fit the story people already believed about a grieving kid who wasn't quite thinking straight. A couple of the older farmers even stopped by the property to warn him about it directly, the way small towns tend to correct each other whether asked to or not. One suggested he was better off scrapping the whole idea and putting the mirrors toward something more useful, like fixing up the barn roof Walt never got around to patching. Ethan listened politely, thanked them for the advice, and kept doing exactly what he'd been doing all along. Except that wasn't what Ethan was doing at all. He'd never once tried to angle a mirror to send a beam of light down into the well shaft. That idea had never crossed his mind. What he actually did every single morning before the sun came up over the tree line was walk out to the well in the dark and adjust each mirror's angle by hand. Nobody saw him do it. He was gone again by the time the first pickup trucks rolled down the road toward the fields. The real mystery, the one nobody in town had even thought to ask, was why sunrise mattered to him at all. If he wasn't trying to direct heat into the well, what was he doing out there in the cold morning air, tilting pieces of broken glass by fractions of an inch? The answer had everything to do with dew. Overnight, as temperatures drop, moisture in the air condenses onto cool surfaces. Anyone who's walked across a lawn at dawn and felt their shoes soak through already knows this without needing a textbook. Stone holds its coolness longer than open soil does, and a well shaft lined with old rock stays cooler still, tucked below ground level where the sun's heat takes longer to reach. Ethan wasn't trying to heat the well. He was trying to protect that narrow window each morning when the air was coolest and moisture was most likely to gather before the rising sun burned it all away. Positioning the mirrors just right meant redirecting glare away from the well's mouth during those early hours, keeping the shaded microclimate around the stone rim intact just a little longer each day. It was a small thing, almost nothing, measured against a drought severe enough to crack county roads. But small things, repeated patiently over months and years, have a way of adding up in ways that surprise people who only look at problems in a hurry. Everybody in town assumed the well was bone dry, the same way an old ditch looks dry until you dig down a foot and find the soil still holds moisture below the surface crust. The well wasn't producing standing water anyone could draw a bucket from. That much was true. But underground, cool air still moved through the old stone shaft, carrying with it faint traces of humidity that never quite disappeared, sheltered from the punishing heat above by several feet of packed earth and rock. Ethan's mirrors weren't creating water out of nothing. Nobody serious believed reflective glass could conjure moisture from thin air. What the mirrors did, arranged and adjusted the way he'd learned through years of trial and error, was help preserve a slightly cooler, more shaded pocket of air around the well's stone rim during the critical hours just before and after sunrise. Less direct heat hitting the exposed stone meant less moisture lost to evaporation during the part of the day when humidity was already at its highest. It wasn't just the mirrors either. Over time, Ethan had added flat stones around the base to hold ground temperature steady. He'd buried old clay pots nearby, a trick he'd read about from ancient farming practices, using unglazed clay to slowly release moisture into surrounding soil. He'd layered mulch to slow evaporation from the ground itself, and he'd planted native prairie grasses whose deep root systems were built for exactly this kind of dry climate. None of it was flashy. None of it would have made for an impressive photograph on its own. Together, though, it formed a quiet, patient system, one built entirely on paying attention to details most people rush past. When word eventually got around about what he'd actually been doing, the town's reaction shifted again. The mirrors weren't the answer people had been looking for. They were one small piece of something far more deliberate, a whole approach built from observation rather than any single miracle fix. People who'd spent months assuming they understood exactly what they were looking at were starting to realize they'd misunderstood nearly everything. Around this time, one neighbor, an older man named Dale, who'd laughed as hard as anyone months earlier, quietly started showing up before sunrise to help carry mirrors. Funny thing about people, they'll laugh while you're carrying the first mirror across a dusty field, roll their eyes, maybe even film it for a joke. But somewhere around the 10th mirror, once they finally understand why you're doing it, some of them show up to help carry the next one. If you've ever believed in an idea before anyone else did, before it made sense to the people around you, you're in good company here. Go ahead and subscribe, because stories like this one are a good reminder that today's joke sometimes turns into tomorrow's lesson. And we've only uncovered half of this mystery so far. The drought that had been tightening its grip for months finally arrived in full. Parts of North America have seen severe multi-year droughts in recent decades, the kind that reshape entire farming communities, and this particular summer landed squarely in that pattern. The county reservoir dropped low enough that boat ramps sat stranded on dry, cracked mud 20 feet from the waterline. Creeks that had run steadily for generations disappeared entirely, leaving nothing behind but pale gravel beds. Neighboring wells started failing one by one, some going dry overnight, others turning up water too thick with sediment to use. Livestock auctions picked up as ranchers made the hard call to sell off cattle they could no longer feed or water. Cornfields that should have stood tall and green by midsummer curled brown at the edges, stalks bending under their own weight. Hay prices climbed high enough that some families started talking, quietly at first, and then not so quietly, about whether it made sense to keep farming here at all. It was a kind of summer that tests whether a town holds together or starts to come apart at the seams. Then, one morning in late July, somebody noticed something strange behind the old smokehouse on the Whitfield place. Water was still coming up from Ethan's well. Not much. Nowhere near what the property needed to run at full capacity, but enough carefully managed to keep a small garden alive. Enough for a handful of fruit trees Walt had planted years earlier. Enough to water a few chickens and a milking goat that had otherwise been on the list to sell off. Word spread fast. Neighbors who'd driven past that well 100 times without a second thought started slowing down to look. The moisture that had somehow been preserved around that stone rim, protected by years of patient, careful management, had held on longer than anyone would have believed possible. People who'd spent an entire drought watching their own wells give out were standing in Ethan's yard asking questions they'd never bothered asking before. It wasn't a team of scientists who finally pieced together what Ethan had actually built. It wasn't engineers from the state agricultural office either, though a few eventually did show up once word reached the county extension service. It was Miss Delacroix, the retired geography teacher, who put it together first. She'd been watching Ethan for years the way retired teachers tend to watch promising students, quietly and from a distance. When she finally sat down with him one afternoon and asked him to walk her through everything he'd been doing, she realized within an hour that what looked like a strange obsession was actually a rigorous, self-taught study. He'd been tracking wind direction for years, noting which way it shifted, the humidity around the property during different seasons. He'd measured stone temperature by hand at different times of day, building a rough but consistent sense of how heat moved through the well shaft. He'd watched condensation patterns on cool mornings and compared them against evaporation losses on hot afternoons, adjusting his mirror placements accordingly, season after season, based on nothing but careful observation and a willingness to be wrong and try again. What he'd rebuilt, without ever calling it by any formal name, was a version of low-tech water management techniques that farmers had used for generations before modern irrigation made that kind of patient attention unnecessary. Groundwater recharge, evaporation control, soil moisture retention through mulch and native plants, the strategic use of reflective and shaded surfaces to manage microclimate around a water source. None of it was new information, exactly. Old farming journals, the kind Walt had spent his life collecting, were full of similar ideas, half remembered and half forgotten by a generation that had leaned hard on deep wells and powered pumps instead. What made Ethan's version remarkable wasn't the underlying science. It was the years of quiet, disciplined observation he'd poured into applying it, entirely on his own, without anyone teaching him how. Miss Delacroix, who'd spent her career trying to get teenagers to care about soil composition and weather patterns, found herself sitting across from a boy who'd already figured most of it out through sheer persistence. She asked to see Walt's notebook, the one with the half-finished entries. Turning through the pages, she recognized handwriting she'd seen before, decades earlier, when Walt himself had been a student in her very first year of teaching. She hadn't put it together until that moment. The boy sitting across from her had somehow picked up a thread his grandfather started asking about long before either of them were born, when neither man had lived to see fully answered. That detail made its way around town faster than almost anything else in the whole story. People who'd spent months treating the Whitfield well as an oddity started treating it as something closer to an unfinished family project, one that had finally, after 2 generations, found its answer. For years, the whole town had assumed Ethan's obsession with that well traced straight back to grief. A boy who'd lost his parents, building something strange as a way of holding on to them. There was some truth buried in that assumption, but not the version people had settled on. Ray and Carol Whitfield hadn't just been vegetable farmers selling produce at a Saturday market. They'd spent years talking, quietly, about wanting to make the family farm resilient enough that a bad drought year wouldn't decide whether their family ate well or struggled. Ray used to tell Walt he didn't want his kids growing up the way he had, watching a single dry summer wipe out a whole year's work. They never got the chance to build any of it themselves. Walt kept that dream alive in the only way he knew how, through his notebooks and his half-finished observations, even after his son and daughter-in-law were gone. And when Walt passed too, that unfinished dream landed squarely on the shoulders of a teenage boy who'd spent years quietly absorbing everything his Grandfather had never taught him, whether he realized it at the time or not. The mirrors were never really about the past. They weren't a memorial, and they weren't a way of grieving in some strange roundabout fashion. They were about making sure another family, someday, somewhere down the road, wouldn't lose everything to a drought, the way his family's dream had almost gotten lost to one. Several years later, that same well behind the old smokehouse has become something of a learning site for the county. Students from the high school visit on field trips, notebooks in hand, listening to a young man who still doesn't talk much unless he's explaining something he actually cares about. Farmers come by to compare notes, some of them the very same neighbors who once left mirrors by their mailboxes as a joke. Researchers from the state extension office have taken an interest, too, curious about blending old-fashioned observation with more modern water conservation methods. The mirrors are still out there, most of them anyway, cracked in places, weathered by years of sun and wind, their silver backing peeling further with each passing season. Dale still stops by most mornings to help adjust a few of them, a habit that stuck long after it needed to. Nobody laughs anymore when they see them. People around town still like to say the mirrors save the farm. Ethan hears it often enough, and he always responds the same way, shaking his head just slightly. No, he'll say, they only made people look in the right direction.